say I've had a brilliant time preparing for the call with these amazing people that we're going to have today. So I hope it will be as useful, that the panel itself will be as useful and interesting as the preparation has been. So hopefully everybody will find it interesting. But just before we get started, what I'd like to do is, obviously Sean introduced you guys, but I want to go around the room and ask you a question. My question is racism a problem at the moment? And at the same time that you talk a little bit, really shortly, about what you do if this is a problem. I think we know the answer. So I'll start with you, Troy, if that's all right with you. All right. You're on mute. Oh.
Sorry, that's not a great start, is it? But is racism a problem? Yes, it's still a massive problem. And many people will direct to society and say there's an issue in society. But it's an issue that has remained in football for far too many years to mention. And it's an issue that obviously this season, the season as it currently is, has seen some, really extreme cases of alleged racism, some of them because they've not been found, the perpetrators have not been found guilty. But also situations around the globe where, we talk here in England, talk constantly about as well. And sometimes we talk very well about what happens globally, but we don't talk very well about what happens in-house. So the issues around that are that, players and predominantly Black and ethnic minority players are now not comfortable about playing the game without having to speak out about a topic that, continually raises its ugly head and continually is a source of opinion for some who believe that racism is no longer a problem in English football, in European football, in global football. But obviously we still have that massive challenge. Kick It Out is a reporting bureau, so we are an organization that if there's an incident that happens, no matter whether it's in grassroots or whether it's in the highest level of the professional game, if we get a report, we will action that. And the action of us is to pass it on to the relevant bodies. And the clubs. So the relevant bodies would be the FA, who deal with those cases, or county FAs lower down the levels, and liaise with the clubs to make sure that that the incident report gets to where it goes to, and two, for any outcome. The massive problem for me about us as an organisation, and I work for the organisation, as we are not part of any sanctioning body, so we get criticised quite a bit for maybe letting a fan off or a player off after an incident when actually it has nothing to do with us. So we're not a sanctioning body. So we're almost the middle person in between the report and, the outcome. Would I like that to change? Yes, of course I would. But at the moment, we're seen as the bit in between.
Thank you very much, Troy. A great introduction, and the work that Kick It Out is doing is hugely important. And we're going to come back later to the point that you expressed around the reporting mechanisms. Yeah. I'd like to jump into Craig to kind of bounce on the comment from Troy. If you can tell a little bit more about what you do in your own words. And
hi, thanks, Laura. Hi, everybody, and thanks, Sean. My debut on one of these panels, so I'm grateful for that opportunity. Obviously, I agree with Troy. At the top level, we wouldn't be here. And when I say at the top level, I mean the ultimate point is we would not be here if racism wasn't a problem. This discussion would not be happening. And you can say, surely, that so long as there is or are any racism cases coming before the sorts of tribunals Troy just mentioned, the problem exists. So I don't think that there's really an issue over that question. Yes, it's a problem. The extent to which it's a problem, people like Troy, Piara will have statistics, etc., I'm sure, to hand through their organizations as to whether it's becoming more or less of one. But it is a problem. My role in it, oddly in the context of this discussion, and as Ify knows from his time sitting on tribunals, is that I will often be representing the players, managers, any participant, frankly, who is charged with such an offence, a racism offence, amongst other things. But I have previously represented the governing body, the FA, and I also sit at a grassroots level on the anti-discrimination tribunals for the FA. So I hope I'd have a rounded view of it. The answer is, again, yes, there's a problem. But final sentiment from me from that context is this. It's important to note a point Troy just made about alleged cases. My interest is to ensure, of course, there is a fair process by which these cases, once they're detected are dealt with. And I think there is a problem, hopefully I can return to it later, in terms of how the dealing with racism at the disciplinary level is in fact being dealt with. And I think sometimes the public and other organizations get a misperception. And so we see there should be higher sanctions, there should be this and there should be that, based upon really misperception rather than proper educated observations about how the system works.
Thank you very much for these points. And today, the way we prepped for the panel is that we're going to break down the conversation into three big blocks. And the first one is going to be talking about prevention. The second one will be talking about detection, and then intervention. And at this point, we'll elaborate on some of these cases. And I think there will be some interesting debates. But moving on, just to bounce back on your comments, I'd love to move to Piara and for you to give some backgrounds around your work as well.
Sure. Actually, I think Craig's raised some interesting points already about the nature of regulation and how it's done and how it could be done better. And for a conference involving football lawyers, I think that's right where we want to go. But in terms of what we do, we have a whole series of interventions that we try to make on a large scale, particularly a focus on in Europe, but also in Latin America, increasingly in North America. And I think in terms of this conference, one of the most significant things that we do is have a scheme where we have an agreement with UEFA and FIFA separately within the competitions that they directly govern, where we have an analysis of all of the matches that are played, and then identify risk matches and send individuals, usually 2 individuals per match, who are our observers, and they look out for incidents of discrimination. I can talk about some of the data from the Champions League and Europa League. We analyze about 700 matches a season, and our observers, I would say, attend about 100 of those. And of those 100 matches, we record 20 to 30 incidents at those matches, which is about 4% of the matches that are taking place. And roughly 60% of those cases that we put forward, or the reports that we've put forward, end up in cases that are sanctioned by UEFA. Other cases are not sanctioned because of a lack of evidence, or because there's a reassignment, if you like, of the offence. So that's a scale. We're saying that 4% of matches that we're aware of, that we collect evidence within European club football, will see very visible, very, very clear acts of discrimination. And that might be the sort of obvious stuff from banners inside stadiums to the sort of abuse of players of a minority background, abuse of fans on the basis of discrimination, not just racism, I should say. So that's a sort of clear data point that we're looking at. And of course, when we look at this sort of stuff, there's no question that this is just the tip of the iceberg. You are never going to be able to regulate or police or even detect minor infractions. People saying things to someone else, an individual who mutters something under their breath, that type of thing goes unrecorded, unreported, and there's no way of looking at what's happening. I agree with Troy, actually, that the last couple of seasons we have seen a lot of incidents. Ironically enough, before the coronavirus broke out, we were using the language of a pandemic, of a global pandemic. And, because we thought that it had very much the characteristics of the pandemic that we're seeing right now. A little bit unfortunate now to use that language, but we saw a lot of people a lot of fans inside stadiums who were picking up things that were going on elsewhere, seeing that those behaviors are not sanctioned, there's no action taken against them, there's no consequences. And we saw this sort of spread into places where, generally you don't see these sort of behaviors taking place. And I think for the last 2 or 3 years, it's been pretty serious. A lot of it also, previous to that, I think, in the 2015 plus period, the refugee situation in Europe drove some of that. We saw a lot of right-wing groups organizing. We saw a lot of anti-Muslim hate. But obviously a lot of this also comes back down to players. And I think this is also, we're talking here about stadiums, we're not talking about social media abuse, and then we're not talking about the other forms of racism that many people would feel uncomfortable about, which is the lack of diversity that we see inside clubs, institutions, some of that which leads directly to the incidents that we see inside stadiums.
Obviously, we only have an hour and a half, but these are some of the points that I'd still like to raise, specifically in the first part of our conversation, because I do believe they are quite important. And from some of the comments that we received, these were actually raised quite a lot. So really good point. Thank you very much, Piara, for sharing this data. If we can move to Ify and get your perspective on this, that would be wonderful.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. So I entirely endorse and agree with what everyone has said. Clearly, racism is still a problem that we're dealing with. I think there's two strands that we probably will look at as part of this talk, and both, in fact, everyone has touched on them already. You have the racist abuse element, which is, in preparation for this talk, I was looking at some of the statistics, and I'm sure Piara and Troy will come onto those in a moment, but The Guardian reported that racist incidents in football are up 50%, sorry, and that was as of last season. There's been more than 150 football-related incidents of racist abuse already this season. And so you have that element, which everyone is well known. But also, and Piara just touched on this, the inclusion element isn't often spoken about in football on these shores. So the representation of Black and other ethnic minorities at board level in decision-making positions, that does bleed into how certain decisions dealing with racism are made. And so there's a two-pronged issue of racism in football, in my opinion. In terms of my involvement, as Craig already mentioned, as a lawyer, I act on discipline cases as a tribunal member, predominantly chairing cases which involve discrimination elements. I've been doing that for about 5 or 6 years, and I was part of the inception of a specialist discrimination panel at the Football Association. Of course, I've also represented participants charged with discrimination offences.
Great, so thank you very much, Ify, and I like how the conversation is already flowing in an interesting direction. And just so you know, I can see the questions that are being asked. So I can see Michael Surli, sorry if I don't pronounce the name correctly, and Mark O'Neill. And I will come to your questions shortly because they fit in quite well with actually the next presenter, panelist, who's also absolutely amazing. And it's been great to do some preparation with you as well. So Elaine, it would be wonderful for you to speak about this, to speak about your role, and to also talk about representation and going on Ify's point around this. That would be wonderful.
Yes, I also agree with what everyone has said today.
We can't hear you very well. If you maybe a little bit louder, sorry.
Oh, I think I turned the mic down. Turn it up. Sorry, can you hear me better now?
A little bit. I think you'll need to speak a tiny bit loud, sorry.
Right, okay.
Thank you.
I think I can turn it up. I'm not quite sure why it's not coming up now. Sorry, I turned it down because it was reverbing, but can you hear me now?
We can hear you, it's fine. Right. And I think we can all turn our mics or microphone up, that's
Sorry,
fine.
I'll fix it whilst the next speaker's on. But just to say, my background is as an employment discrimination barrister in disciplinary regulatory work, and that covers also sports law as well. And I'm quite familiar with those areas, and I've worked for a number of years with Kick It Out, for example. And we, for many years, have been talking about these issues. And I feel like we haven't really progressed much in the sport, in the basic issues. They still very much remain. And following on from what Ify said about leadership in sport and diversity, I think it's really important that the business benefits of diversity are embraced. And I think it's been widely proved, there's a lot of empirical research from places like PricewaterhouseCoopers, Work Foundation, that when you have a diverse group of people making decisions, problem solving is increased exponentially. And so there's an understanding of discrimination and how to actually deal with it. So I think what's happened over the years is that there have been some initiatives to improve diversity, for example, off the pitch, looking at management and looking at all. But it hasn't really gone far enough. For example, this Rooney Rule issue in terms of management of football teams has been voluntarily implemented. It hasn't been an actual compulsory issue. And it can be easily circumvented if the recruitment is not an open and transparent recruitment. I think that's one of the issues that arises in football. Very often managers are just sacked and then replaced. There's not been a recruitment, so therefore there's not an opportunity for a BAME candidate to be put forward. So I think there needs to be an intention, but there needs to be more than that. And I think if more progressive steps can be made and there can be better diversity in leadership, we'll see a better understanding of how to handle discriminatory events when they occur, and that then will aid the prevention of those acts occurring as well.
So that's actually really interesting comments, and I'm just going to jump into one of the questions that's been asked. So obviously, Elaine, you talk about this imperfection about the Rooney Rule, which could be improved, but the question is, would the panel like to see something like the Rooney Rule introduced throughout the whole of professional, semi-professional football in England and the rest of the UK and maybe the rest of the world? Why not? Who would like to jump in on this point? Maybe Ife?
Yeah.
Troy? Sorry, Troy, go on.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, the Rooney Rule in its current form in English football is called the Mandatory Code. It only exists in the English Football League. So that's the Championship down to the League Two. The Premier League haven't taken it on board and won't take it on board. Non-league football has better representation in the management and coaching circles, maybe not at the highest level, which is obviously you know, the national conference, but definitely in the leagues below, you know, the representation doesn't seem to be an issue, although it could be better. But there's also the fact that there's a loophole to this mandatory code that we have here in England. And as far as I'm concerned, that loophole is that the only time that they have to really adhere to it is when there's an open recruitment process. So what you have is, you know, on more than enough occasions is the board will sack a manager and have already been speaking days ahead or weeks ahead with the potential replacement. And so actually the sacking will happen maybe, well, we know of an incident where sackings have happened on the Saturday morning at 11 o'clock. And by the 12 o'clock, the new manager is already in place. So that is not an open recruitment process. And that means that they do not have to adhere to the mandatory code. So that slight bit of wording actually makes it easier for board members, chairmen to make a decision and then to crack on and not have to worry about the fact that they may have, you know, gone against the rule of our version of the Rooney Rule in this country. So first and foremost, there needs to be better wording around that process. And also ultimately, you know, just touching on that point of better diversity would be able then to enable, as we've just heard, better decision making, but also better reflection of the coaches that may come in. Because for far too many years, we've been bounding about figures of 4, 5, 6, 7. I think we got as high as 9 before in terms of black and ethnic minority managers. But let's be serious, that's out of 92. You know, so percentage wise, we're down by, you know, to 1%, 2%, which is absolutely ridiculous when you think of how many black and ethnic minority players, you know, are playing football in English football, you know. So the disparity just doesn't make sense. And for me, there's a definite blockage somewhere, the highest level of the game. But that can be seen in quite a number of circles, to be totally honest, when it comes down to, you know, better representation, you know. We really don't particularly discuss the issue of the lack of Asians playing football and then transferring into the coaching circles, because we're still trying to break that barrier of them getting in, you know, when they're good enough to get into the playing side of things as well.
That's very good points. And I think the point that Elaine also made about, and you made about the value of diversity outside of football and outside of sport, there's a lot of studies that show clearly diversity, there's a direct correlation with success of a company and the diversity of their board and diversity of management. So it makes sense. Why it's not implemented is a good question, but I'd like to go to Piara or whoever wants to jump in, but trying to understand, is there good practices, or is there something that's good, maybe internationally, that we could learn from and that we could maybe try to bring in wherever the people who are listening into this conversation are? Piara, you're on mute, sorry. Thank you.
Sorry, I think it's difficult, to find better practices in football, unfortunately, than we have in England right now. And it's just England, it's not the whole of the UK. I think the things in place here in England are flawed, as Troy has just said. The Football League scheme, it doesn't go far enough. There's no evaluation, seemingly no independent evaluation. People can cut corners quite easily. The Premier League are still busy talking about the pipeline when we know there are enough qualified coaches out there. And in terms of the FA, they have a sort of a shortcut scheme, which is doing well in terms of getting prominent black coaches in the different England setups, but it's not embedded and it's difficult to see how it's systemized. I think the only example we've got really is the US. The NFL has been introduced the Rooney Rule in 2003. They've been hammered since then because of the lack of, in particular, head coaches. They have 4 minority head coaches, 1 Hispanic guy and 3 African Americans, and 70% of their players, their athletes, are from a minority background, mainly African Americans. So you can see that disparity. We have a similar disparity in the UK, but it's even greater in the NFL. And the changes that the NFL have just announced, both to the Rooney Rule and the other changes that go along with that, are the sort of thing that we need to see. And I think the interesting thing about it is that it's a dynamic system. You have the Rooney Rule, which has been fixed for a long time. And now they're saying, we will produce more data. We will look at our pipelines. We will look at the types of people that are leaving the industry in order to make sure that we can replace them with more diverse candidates. They are looking at doing things that are pretty unknown and unheard of in sport until now. So it's going to be interesting to follow the success or otherwise of what they do. And I think in the end, we have to go the same route. I mean, it's beyond me, as someone who sees the Premier League marketing across the world, the way in which they draw on the Premier League as a very diverse league, as a league where a player from Africa or Latin America can come up from humble beginnings and make it as a big superstar in probably the biggest clubs in this country. They don't pay any attention to this. Or they've chosen deliberately to ignore the issue and to rely on a market answer, which is not delivering the sort of diversity that we need. That's in coaching and also in administration. Even the global owners here, and we have, I think, 5 or 6 NFL owners that have clubs in the Premier League or the Championship. Even they are not doing what we see them doing in the NFL. And the reason being, and I think this is going to be a big theme for most of my answers, is the lack of regulation. We need harder regulation, we need stronger regulation, we need people telling the owners and others as to the sort of things they want to see, to make it a priority. Otherwise, I think we'll carry on as we have been for very, 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 very many years, since black players have made a big impact in English football. We'll carry on in the same way for a very long time, unfortunately, unless we address this issue head on.
Just very quickly, Laura, jumping on that. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Troy.
Just that last point, one of the points that Piara made about the difference between England and what's happening in the NFL. English football doesn't share data very well. So actually, when they do collect the data, they keep it to themselves. And I think there's no way of us understanding how the mandatory code is working at the English version of the Rooney Rule, because we don't have the shared data to appreciate that. So we don't know how many black and ethnic minority managers have gone for coaching positions. We don't know if the academies are much better doing it than the professional side of the game. the shared data is a massive problem in this country, because it seems like when we collect data, we keep it to ourselves and that's it, it's ours to own. So that would be a massive step forward to identifying issues and then putting the things in place that Piara was discussing just then, to make change in this country. Wonderful. Sorry.
Ife, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, no, in fact, I was going to make the precise point that's been well made by Troy. It's difficult to see how, can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's difficult to see the results of how that's been implemented in this country. But another thing I was going to touch on is, why is it that you have this great disparity that we've all talked of, when the data, as Elaine already suggested, clearly shows that diverse organizations outperform those which aren't. That's clear, and most people at boardroom level know that. And the reason being, the only reason I can think of is it's the way society still looks at Black and ethnic minorities involved in sport, who they perceive don't have the intellectual ability, the intellectual rigor to operate at that high level. That's still the racist perception that exists. And unfortunately, I think it's going to take regulation to address that. Positive discrimination, it comes with its challenges. There's sometimes a perception that appointments aren't based on merit. But I think it will take something like the Rooney Rule to demonstrate, candidates who may not have had the opportunity for them to excel in those positions once they're in place.
Really interesting. So some of the things that we want from this conversation is also to have kind of actionable action. And if that's okay, Piara, I just want to jump into a question that's being asked by one of the participants. So I think it's Iselt Cody, probably mispronounce. Sorry, I'll blame this on me being French and being very bad at pronouncing. But Iselt Cody asked, with a large rise in the last year in reported racist incidents in English football, cited by some as added to by the Brexit referendum, in an English context, other than current efforts to stamp out racism through educational efforts and high-profile campaigns like No Room for Racism, what further steps would the panelists advocate? So we mentioned already one very concrete thing that should be put in place is this tracking and sharing of data to already help make better decisions. Elaine, would it be something that you'd like to jump in, maybe?
Yeah, I wanted to say, because following on from what Troy said, of course, we've had the No Room for Racism by the Premier League, and we've also got In Pursuit of Progress by the FA. And we have the mandatory code, but it's not enforced in the Premier League. And so what that does, it actually undermines the whole veracity of the process. If you're saying it's not going to apply to the biggest league, the Premier League, then what teeth does it really have? What message does it send out to managers, to boardrooms, if it's not even on the table? So in one way, a step has been made, but in another way, it's actually really not doing enough. And of course, we do need to have openness and transparency to really make a difference. So I think really we need to give power to these initiatives. If the FA are going to adopt a mandatory code, then it needs to apply to the Premier League. I think that's vitally important, because it will then elevate the real importance of this issue if they're serious about tackling racism in sport.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. Piara?
I think one of the things, I don't want to keep going back to the same thing, but one of the things that English football, which is the question relates to English football, and actually other territories, people need to do is actually to diversify, because in that way you see minorities, people of color, in a different way other than in those standardized ways in which you would see them as the athlete on the field, or as the steward, or as the cleaner. And I think this is the other big impact of leadership, of visible minority leadership, that people see you in different ways. They begin to respect you in different ways. And I think that is something that the Premier League and others need to look at if they're serious about tackling racism, because you can't just say to people, don't abuse these athletes on the field of play. Everybody knows that rule. Kick it out is 25 years old. You have to do more than that, right? Otherwise, I think we're really not going to get anywhere, and we're actually just scratching the surface when there are more fundamental issues at play. And I just wanted to just build on something Ify said, that when we talk about these initiatives, we're not talking about positive discrimination, of course. We're talking about, the Rooney Rule is a mechanism. It's a mechanism to get people interviewed, people who are already qualified from a pool of identified and qualified people that have been identified. There's only one territory in Europe which allows for positive discrimination, and that is Norway in terms of gender employment. Otherwise, in this country, for example, positive discrimination is unlawful. So we're not talking about giving people anything other than a fair opportunity. I think that's really important to stress.
Mm-hmm. Very good point. Troy, I think you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to say about that last question and, the different initiatives. There is a very good initiative in place, but I don't think it's having the impact that it should. The PFA and the FA run a program called On Board, which is about governance, which is learning about governance, which is then upskilling ex-professional players or people that are working around the game, predominantly but not solely, to the Black, Asian and ethnic minority people. And I think that is a process that actually needs to be rolled out a little bit more, and then for there to be tangible outcomes in terms of seeing, these people that qualify from there going on to very big and prominent positions. We've seen Les Ferdinand do that, probably one of the only Black members on a board, in the position that Les has. But there's been a number of people that have gone through that process and come out the other side of that process. But yet I'm not seeing them go into the game. I was part of that process, and it allowed me to go and sit on a board at county FA level, which was great, but there was actually no progression after that. And I think if I'm like that, many other people have been through that process, have come out the other end, have received the certificate, but actually there's been no kind of joined up approach in terms of then maybe getting on boards at clubs or within the industry to be able to then use the skills that they've just learned to then go and influence the game at a different level. So it's a good program in a sense, but I think it needs to be rolled out and to be have a bigger impact in the game.
Thank you very much, Troy. And to anyone who's listening in, Sean is putting information and background information and articles in the chat. So have a look. There's some really interesting articles there. Craig, we haven't heard from you, but I'd like to kind of get your points on some of the rules that are in place and get your thoughts on it as well.
Yeah, all right. Well, with regard to the Rooney Rule, I remain silent because I acknowledge that the other speakers here are on a day-to-day basis more engaged with the implementation of that rule. But it goes without saying, I agree with everything they've said. But could I pick up on something Piara said in that context, but often gets said about regulations in the context in which I operate? And what he said was that there's not enough regulation, and harder regulation is needed. Now, I appreciate that was being said in the context of the Rooney Rule, and I understand why he said it. But that is something which is often thrown out about the governing bodies, more often in disciplinary context. They're not doing enough. They should be easier to prove cases. Once proved, the sanctions should be higher. But I'd just like to really emphasize that if you get to a stage where, for those policy reasons, the participants themselves, the people I represent, who are massively damaged when an allegation is made against them, and rightly so if they're actually guilty of it, but in any event, they need to see that a fair process is occurring. And a concern that I have about that sort of stock phrase of larger and harsher regulation in a disciplinary context is that what you end up doing is polarizing participants and then getting stronger views, which really don't help the fight against racism long term. And I'm just going to ask, I think Rustam and Chris Bond, who are moderating the call, have got a link there to a Guardian article. So the Guardian's getting good press today. A Guardian article by Louise Taylor, which came out it was December, I think, so 4 or 5 months ago. And what she did was she analysed, frankly, on an erroneous basis. I apologise if she's on the call, but that's a fact as a matter of law. She analysed the multiple cases which have gone through the FA's regulatory system and made observations such as the decisions were inconsistent, the sanctions were varied, nobody understood the decisions, etc., etc., so that her emphasis turned back to the fact that in order to have certainty in these cases, the burden and standard of proof should be on the FA to basically either a criminal standard of proof, so what most people would know is beyond reasonable doubt, or the UEFA and FIFA levels of proof, comfortable satisfaction. Whereas at the moment, we have a standard in the FA of beyond, on the balance of probability. So the lowest level of standard of proof that can apply. And so I feel as though this regulation bashing in the disciplinary context sometimes goes too far and could have negative long-term impacts, because I appreciate you're on, I'm on a clock, Laura, but just to emphasize a point, when a player, I shouldn't say player, I should say participant or a club, when they are charged with a disciplinary offence, be it racism or discrimination or otherwise, they've got four choices. They either admit it out of genuine remorse and contrition, they either admit it because the evidence is overwhelming, they've got no choice, in which case they will say they're contrite and remorseful because they want the benefit of such an approach. They will deny it falsely and dishonestly because they don't want to be seen as racist in the press, or they will deny it because it genuinely didn't happen. And we have to acknowledge in these processes, goes back to a word I picked up on something Troy said earlier, that where that scenario happens, i.e. there's a denial of the offence, there needs to be a fair and just process to resolve it. And my genuine opinion is that so far as the disciplinary machinery at the FA, certainly, and I've looked at the Football Association of Wales's regulations, which Phil Draper's amended recently in Wales, when one looks at those, it's difficult to see how the process could be more favourable to proving charges, and I don't mean in any biased way, but couldn't be more favourable to having charges proved, unless it tipped the balance over to becoming unfair to the participants. And sometimes it's already there. And I'm happy to come back to this and explain why I say that in a moment, but I don't want to hog the time. But I think we should be careful about regulation bashing when it comes to disciplinary sort of mechanisms.
Thank you very much. I'm sure everybody agrees that everything should be fair. I think the definition of fair might potentially be argued, but does anyone want to discuss?
Yeah, I'm on PR. I'm with PR. I mean, I have regularly bashed the FA process, if you want me to be totally honest, having been through a process twice myself from a grassroots perspective, and then trying to work with the FA to make that process better at that level. And then I hear the voices of players who have been victimized, not only on the field of play or, you know, by the crowd, but also by a process as well. So, Craig, I'm not here to bash you because I fully understand exactly where you're coming from and what you're saying.
It's an open debate and it's about confronting racism. So I'm happy to
that's
be back.
Right.
No
no, that's right. But I think we're at a stage where players feel victimized quite a number of times over. Participants, you're right, feel victimized quite a number of times over. And I'm currently on, without mentioning what they are, 2 cases that have been ongoing since the first day of this season, as it still exists, you know, and I don't think there's enough empathy in a way that how that impacts on an individual, how that impacts on that individual's family members and close support unit, and how that individual has to every single time get up and go and do his job, their job, whilst having that hanging over them. And that could be part of a police investigation, that could be part of an FA investigation. So I'm getting it from the other side now. And there's also a case, and I think there's been a question about it, the Jonathan Lecco case with Casilla from Leeds, where, you know, we got criticised as kicking out quite a little bit in that case. But the ultimate outcome of that was that the FA was pushing for more matches than the committee that were adjudicating on the case gave. And again, when you're out in the industry, you're thinking, well, why was it not 10 matches? Why was it only 8? Why did the FA could not overpower? And you'll probably be able to both, you and If, you'll probably be able to both tell me that a little bit more, but it's the confusion that is the worrying thing. And then for me, it's the impact on the human being.
Elaine, would you like to maybe jump in on this topic? I think you're on mute, sorry.
Yes, on mute.
Right, perfect, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that, well, I saw there was a question about quotas, which I think it was just following on what Ify said and what Piara said about the distinction between positive action, which we have, which is lawful, and positive discrimination, which is something more like quotas, which is not lawful within the Equality Act. But the initiatives that we are taking, which in terms of the mandatory code, is positive action. And if that's actually followed, that would have an impact if it was actually implemented at the very highest levels. And we could see the data on that. I think that would be very, very significant. But I think what we need to do is utilize effectively the law that we have, and not to be afraid of using these initiatives and saying, oh, well, you know, is it because they don't have merit? That is ridiculous. Of course they have merit, else they wouldn't be in the frame. And I think we have to sort of disabuse these arguments that are raised against very often ethnic minority candidates, as if they're getting it and they don't deserve it, they haven't earned it. I think that is not the case, far from the case. In fact, it works the opposite way round in reality. So I think we need to step up, we need to demand better, I think, from our leaders in the sport, and we need to see the lawful positive action steps implemented at a higher level.
Thank you very much. And I've been asked by Sean, who's in charge of the panel, to read out loud the names and the questions. So you've already answered, but the question was from Yugansh Agawal with special quotas for BAME communities in the UK in regards to the Equality Act of 2010, especially in leadership roles, eventually challenged the meritocratic characteristic of sport, football in specific. So thank you for answering a little bit this question.
Laura.
Yes, please.
Can I just add to that discussion about how regulation deals with cases? Because I think there's two distinct issues. There's the issue about which Craig touched upon, how cases are decided and the standard of proof. And then there's a separate issue of once a case is found approved, how are those who have been found proven of acting in a discriminatory manner, how are they dealt with by the regulations? Do the regulations have enough teeth? Are the sanctions as harsh as they should be? And I think there are two distinct issues, but the first issue dealing with the standard of proof, I think there is growing debate, as Craig mentioned, about moving this standard up. And in fact, you'll see this debate in many of the cases which I sit on. Indeed, the debate was raised by Craig before me in the Forestieri case. It's been raised in Hennessy, in Peter Beardsley, and you'll have those lawyers acting for participants charged, arguing that rather than the civil standard, the balance of probability, the panel should be imposing, imposing a civil standard, but requiring cogent evidence before finding cases proved due to the serious nature of the charge. My view is, I mean, it's clear why you have these arguments. Racist allegations are, they're high stakes. And as has already been discussed, players, the victims, the alleged victims are under immense pressure. The players accused face reputational damage as well as their clubs they're attached to. It's widely reported. So there are significant pressures on the system itself. And that's why you're having this debate about should there be a higher standard of proof. But in my view, the regulations actually, and I try and say this without being biased, but I think the regulations do already incorporate this aspect of being cautious. Where you have serious allegations, one must be satisfied that somebody would be prepared to commit an act of that serious nature to the required legal standard. And in the Forestieri case, we inserted in our decision a quote from a House of Lords decision, which we couldn't put any better, which talked about having, you know, if you saw a lioness in Regent's Park, or if you were told about a lioness in Regent's Park, you would require probably more cogent evidence to be convinced it was a lioness rather than an Alsatian. So you can determine those cases on the same civil standards of proof. In terms of sanction, my view is there should be enough flexibility for panel members to look at the cases on an individual basis, I think already there's a risk of double counting, because the minimum sanctions for racist cases are actually quite high. And there has to be some flexibility for the panel to look at each case on its own merits. And there should be an appreciation that what the guidelines suggest is actually the minimum. It's not an entry point, which sometimes is conflated.
Thank you very much, Ife. I think Piara would like to jump in as well.
Yeah, I think I want to say that I think I saw a lion wandering around Regent's Park on Sunday, actually. I think that there's a couple of things, I think. First is that Craig took my call for better regulation of the industry in terms of what we're doing on diversity, and sort of took it into the domain of regulation of player behavior, of the rules of the game, which I think is also important. I was not referring to regulation in that sense, but I think that one of to counter your point, actually, one of the things we need to be very careful about is that rules and regulations, particularly when they concern things around discrimination, racism, and other elements, are very hard fought for, right? We've had a whole series, I don't know, maybe 3 generations of incidents in football alone, where people have become victims of racism. Some say that racism forced them out of the match, out of the game, both from crowds and also from individuals, from opposition players, from their own teammates. I mean, you only have to talk to, say, someone like Howard Gale, and he will give you his experience maybe of 30 years ago. So we have to be careful, I think, before we start putting the alleged perpetrator, their interests above the interests of the victims, which is, I think, the point that Troy was making. If a process is fair and can deliver justice for the victim, then it'll also deliver justice for the perpetrator, I believe. And I think part of the problem that we have is that often there is no justice on either side. The system is often too slow, doesn't deliver on the public expectations of it. I think that I feel the Louise Taylor article that's been shared, is one of those sort of things that seems to suggest, that being called a racist is actually worse than being a racist. And this is a wider debate, which is very, very difficult it provides for a lot of difficult conversations with a lot of people. Being called a racist is not as difficult as being a racist, right? It's not the same as being a racist. The impact is very different, and we should be very clear about that. And the rights of perpetrators or alleged perpetrators should be held in balance. And at the moment, when it comes to individual cases, it seems to me that the FA do a fairly good job there. Where they probably don't do a very good job is in looking at crowd behavior, in sanctioning clubs where their fans have been racist. And I can give a very clear example of that, of a case involving Millwall in the FA Cup. I think it was the 3rd or 4th round against Everton in January 2019, where this is Millwall, I think the 3rd or 4th offence that the FA had adjudicated and found Millwall guilty of, and they got £11,000 fine and an educational programme. Now, I'm not diminishing educational programmes, but I think that's the area where the FA probably needs to look at what it's doing in terms of the charges it's bringing, and then the process that the hearings go through. Now, we work quite well, as I said, with UEFA and FIFA, and those international governing bodies are the governing bodies that probably hit, they're the people that are hammered hardest when it comes to insufficient regulations. So, but we see actually that the comfortable satisfaction standard works quite well. There's a reasonable degree of justice. There are, of course, matches, the Montenegro-England match, where there are calls for higher sanctions. We thought that was proportionate. There are other matches, Bulgaria versus England, where perhaps UEFA got it wrong. But I think overall, if there's a system that is fair, that is transparent, hearings are heard very quickly, the representation and the issues are very clear, then I think justice will generally be delivered. It's not the case that everybody will be happy in every single incident. But I think we need to sort of go back to fundamentals and assess the rights of victim clubs or individuals or national associations and the, if you like, the perpetrators or the alleged perpetrators, and put that in balance. We have a big issue across Europe, and I think if we don't sort of continue to deal with it as we're beginning to deal with it now, then I think that will be a step backwards.
Thank you very much. Elaine, did you want to jump in? You're on mute.
Yes, I mean, I think there are concerning trends across Europe in terms of what's been called tribalisms, growing racial intolerance that we've seen, and it's a real concern. I do think, you know, that the rights of the individuals do need to be balanced. There needs to be a fair process always. But I think that the bigger issue really is, how do we tackle it at a club level? Because I think that is going to be key. And I do think, following on from what Piara said, it's really important to look at how we can tighten up some of these penalties so that clubs do actually feel it where it hurts. Mm-hmm. And I think if they feel it on a more deeper level, they're more likely to take the action that's needed and to improve so that it doesn't keep happening again and again. So you don't have 4 offences in a row. I mean, that's showing that perhaps things aren't being taken quite seriously enough. So I think I'd like to see more steps taken at a club level as well in terms of sanctions against fans' behaviour, as well as individuals.
Thank you very much. I think Craig wants to jump in also. You're on mute, Craig. You're still on mute, yeah.
I didn't actually, but I've seen in the comments section that Mark O'Neill's mentioned the Casilla Lecco case. He says went in some length about the burden and standard of proof, which Ify referred to. Just to update him and maybe others, the Forestieri case, which Ify mentioned, really went into that in some detail as well, because that concerned the overlap of criminal and regulatory proceedings. So that's something which probably is even more advanced in terms of the detail into which it went, and if he was on that panel. And there is currently a case which is impending before the FA. It's public knowledge that it's there. It's the Tom Pope alleged anti-Semitism case. It's pending for hearing. I declare an interest of sorts. I'm acting for the player. And so I can't go into the detail of it, but there's a really interesting issue going to be aired in that case, not about the burden and standard of proof, but the test that should be applied as to whether something is necessarily racist or not. And that's an issue for argument in the Pope case. If anybody wants to look, they can Google Tom Pope case or something, it will come up. So there could be developments, the hearing is awaited, which go to not just the standard of proof, but the nature of the test that is being applied, to which the standard goes on to apply, which could be really important to this discussion. I don't know when it's going to come, because we've got the pandemic sort of inhibiting FA hearings at the moment, but that's one that's out there to look at.
I think
Laura, can I just? Oh, I'm sorry, Piara. I'm cutting across everyone today.
We'll go to Ify first, and then we'll move on to Piara.
Thank you. Just following from what Craig said, I'll have a keen eye on the outcome of this case, because this is something which has been raised a number of times. What is the appropriate test? And at the moment, I mean, cases where there is a dispute of fact, if someone's made a racist comment, those are relatively easy issues to resolve. It's a matter of credibility. The more nuanced position is where you have the actual act is not disputed, but it's the intention behind the act. And so you're looking at the subjective elements, and there's a dichotomy between, well, should we look at, is it objective? Do we look at, is this a racist comment? Is this a racist tweet? Or if the player says, well, actually, I was joking, or I didn't mean it in that way, I meant it completely differently, that there is a subjective element. So that's been raised in the Nicholas Anelka case. It's raised in the Man City player who tweeted his teammate, his name escapes me now.
Mendy.
Yeah, Bernard, yeah, precisely. And also the Peter Beardsley case recently, where he questioned the age of one of the young African players, and he disputed that this was based on a racist view. And so you have this interesting argument or perspective in terms of disciplinary cases, looking at the subjective versus the objective. In my view, I think it's dangerous, and the way I approach cases, you can't look at cases in a vacuum. You have to look at the surrounding context in which actions have been made. And so whilst the test is effectively objective, there's a standard, and if you cross that standard, intention potentially goes to sanction. You would be remiss if you were not considering the wider circumstances, which of course includes the motive and the intention. And it's what somebody who is a reasonable bystander would make of the alleged action. That's essentially where I come from.
Thank you. I think we'll move on to Piara, because that was actually something that you raised in the preparation. So you mentioned Anelka, you mentioned Beardsley, you had mentioned Mendy and Suarez as well. Do you want to jump into this comment about the intention?
The thing is, I think that's covered by direct liability, isn't it? And that is a fundamental principle that applies. The FA applies specifically to discrimination cases. It applies within the FIFA and UEFA regulation. So I don't really see that there's a big debate about that. Of course, if a player admits that he said something, and then part of his mitigation is that he didn't know the definition of the word, that might be some sort of mitigation, but direct liability applies. And this is, if you go back to where the FA really started to do some interesting work on regulation in this area, back to the Suarez Evra case, where they brought in independent experts from Latin America who were conversant in Latin American Spanish, and on the basis of their evidence, judged that Suarez had been racially abusing Evra, hadn't just been calling him a black guy. So I think there's quite a lot of work that the FA has already done in this area that hopefully we're not beginning to undo, because there are more cases that are now making their way into the system.
Well, I think that there's certainly no question that if the panel or tribunal perceives an action to be discriminatory, that's going to be the finding. I think what I was speaking to was rather the borderline cases where a case can be made either side, and I think that's indeed the issue that Craig is probably going to be dealing with in his case. For example, a case which I sat on at the end of last year at grassroots level concerned a black player who had been dismissed from the touchline. And it was, not a stadium, an open field. And the referee asked him to stand by the trees. And so the black player took immediate offense to that. And you can understand why. Anyone who has an appreciation of those issues will know why the black player was immediately offended. And the referee was charged. He had a full tribunal. And in the end, we decided that the case wasn't proved. And that was on the basis of the surrounding evidence. We had evidence about the trees effectively being the perimeter of the park. There was no other objective element to refer to where he's directing the player to stand. And the referee's own evidence, which we found to be credible. And that wasn't actually any, it wasn't a finding against the player's credibility. We appreciated he subjectively felt this was a racist comment, but there's a nuance in terms of objectively, would a reasonable bystander, fully versed in all of the facts, looking at that situation, deem that comment, go and stand by the trees, to be a racist comment.
Can I just put you into the mind very quickly? And I know we've touched on this. Sorry, it's been a long conversation about this, but let me put you into the mind of some of the players as well and what they think, and some of the actions that have happened that have, as far as they're concerned, have not been addressed over a period of time. I want to take you back to 1988, if you don't mind. So those of us that are old enough remember it very well, because we were probably more than teenagers. But there was a banana on a football pitch at Goodison Park aimed at John Barnes. And John Barnes, in a Merseyside derby, absolutely just backflicked the banana off the pitch and absolutely got on with his game. Back then, it was announced, as it should be, as a racist act, an act of racism against a black player, a black individual on a football pitch. 30 years later, we get to the situation, which was a week before Raheem Sterling called out the British media publicly on Instagram, when Aubameyang of Arsenal faced a banana in the North London derby, after a Spurs fan threw it on at him after he scored against Spurs, and you know, was quite rightly celebrating, although I'm a Spurs supporter, so it didn't go down well with me. Everything that came out about that banana, which in 1988 was a racist act, and I'd thought that we'd improved over the years, was a missile with no connotations aimed at racism. That was from the English press. That was from the governing body. That was from when the gentleman, I'm calling him very loosely, kindly went into a court of law. So how far have we progressed when we decide that actually the acts of racism that have existed over years and years and years, by the way, and I've only gone back a few years, how they still exist, but we now class them quite differently. And actually we're losing that connotation of racism. That's one incident. The Luis Suarez incident is, which Piara has brought up. And this is again what the players think. 2011, that, am I right? That incident, that story, or sorry, the sanction came out in 2011, I think on New Year's Eve. What a great time to put a big sanction out like that against one of the top players in the league at the time, playing for one of the top clubs. Why? Because FA wanted it swallowed, as far as I'm concerned, and we can debate that. But then 8 years, 9 years down the line, Casilla is getting the same sanction. 8 games, and players are looking at me saying, well, what has changed? Where have we come in 9 years? Because the incidents are getting progressively more, and we would feel that the authorities would back us a little bit more in terms of how we're going to eliminate this from our game, because they're continuing to happen. And both words, in slightly different language, were exactly the same, directed at black players. And then the Peter Beardsley one frustrates me massively, because of the language and connotation that Beardsley used is absolute racial ignorance. And if we cannot see that and identify that aimed at young players who are trying to learn their trade, you know, if we cannot see that for what it is, you can understand the frustration of the player in all of this and why they feel that, you know, enough's enough. And I've seen a question in there, we haven't answered it, about Mario Balotelli walking off the football pitch. But listen, I'm one that says if the sanctions are not going to match the crime, that players are going to actually take matters into their own hands sooner or later. And we'll be seeing more Mario Balotellis. We'll be seeing more Tysons that happened out in Ukraine. We'll be seeing players walk off the football pitch. And just lastly, I'm really sorry about this. And Piara mentioned again the Bulgarian situation. I felt the English players were let down by UEFA on that day, because the incidents that was mass chanting led to protocols being implemented, being put into place. But the chanting, no matter how small it was, continued. Mm-hmm. So I felt that that game should have been abandoned, or England should have walked. Now that's up for debate. That's, everyone can take that in their own way. But mm-hmm. for me, they were let down by UEFA, and then they continued to play when actually, I would say, no, let's make a stand. And that might be critical from me, and people will judge me for that, but that's where I'm coming from.
That's good. I think, Piara, we'll move on to you, and then just after your comments on this, I will just go through all the questions because we have limited times, and we'll just answer them one by one. So Piara, if you want to go first.
I thought the Bulgaria incident was interesting, Troy, because it brings into another dimension, another issue in terms of the international regulations. Putting aside the UEFA sanction, which we thought didn't go far enough, but during the match, the players and the national coach decided not to leave the field. They came back on for the second half. Now, a lot of people would also say that there are difficult decisions when it comes to these issues, particularly in international football, that the national coach has to show leadership. He apparently asked the players, should we stay or should we go? Now, most people would have said, given the volume of abuse, he just should have said, enough, let's go, we're not coming back. That would have sent out, a very clear message in a way that you wouldn't otherwise get. Regulation in terms of sanctioning is never going to send out a message in that way. And then the previous match to that against Montenegro, where most of the FA hierarchy and the England bench didn't seem to be aware that they had the option to stop the match and speak to the referee. They left it to the UEFA officials and the referee. So, this is a very strong protocol. You have the right to tell the referee or the match delegate what's going on and to assert your right to take direct action. But we've had there an example of a coach who, in one occasion, wasn't aware of it. On the other occasion, chose not to chose not to trigger the mechanism to its full force. Now, I'm not criticizing him. This is one of those heat of the situation moments. But I think the answer to these sorts of incidents in a match situation are quite complicated. We can't always rely on the governing bodies to get it right afterwards. We also have to do things, in game.
But they've brought up something there, Piara. Sorry, Laura. You brought up something which I don't think we will go into, because diverse officials. I don't want to even start there, because ultimately the noises in Montenegro and Bulgaria that were coming through on our TV screens that actually the players heard, that Tyrone Mings and Raheem Sterling had to identify to the officials, but the officials can't hear that. And that's because they're not tuned to hear those kind of noises, because they've never had to experience it before. But I don't want to go there, because we'll never get off this panel if I do. But for me, again, that's,
I think it's fine. This is a really, really interesting topic. And I think even in the prep, we were saying it's very hard to cover everything we want to cover in an hour or an hour and a half. But I'm going to run through a few of the questions, because I think it's important to give the voice to the people who've been sitting and listening to us. But one of the questions would be, what does the panel think of changes to FIFA disciplinary codes, Article 1313 discrimination, which allows for walk-offs? Anyone want to comment on this?
Did you say it allows for walk-offs?
Mm-hmm.
Or doesn't allow?
I don't think it does, but
doesn't allow.
But actually, I think that FIFA have done something very interesting. Emilio Garcia has a good record at UEFA, and what he's done now with the changing of the FIFA code to make it much clearer. We've been working in Latin America where homophobia was rife at every match, and I think it's fair to say that some of the FIFA sanctions in that domain have had an impact and have led to a lot of changes at the Mexican FA, for example, their approach to this sort of issue. And there's an interesting development in the FIFA code, which is, and I'm sure Craig and Ify will be interested in this, and I'm sure Elaine too, which is that a case of racism or other forms of discrimination allows for a victim statement to be put towards the panel in terms of evidence of impact. Now, I think that deals with some of the issues, or tries to deal with some of the issues and the gaps that Troy's identified in terms of the way in which the victim feels, the lack of justice, the lack of, the lack of action during the match. And I think it will be quite significant going forward.
And if you want to have some more information about Article 13, Sean has just posted in the links some more information there. So I'll just move on to the...
Can I just say, Laura,
yes,
one of two lawyers, I don't think, I agree with, I think it was Troy or Piara who just said, I don't think 13 does allow for walk-offs. It deals with a lot of other things as well as the Act, but I printed them out and got them ready at hand in case a technical question came up. I don't think it does, but for the record, I agree with everything both of them they've said about walk-offs. I don't disagree with anything that they've said about walk-offs. It's those... Well, I'm not going to go back into it, but yeah, I don't think 13 does allow for it.
I think
I've missed it, I'll check. But.
I think the comment was about abandoned matched, actually, rather than walk-offs.
Okay, so where the match is abandoned by the referee on account of discrimination, then I think there's a provision which says that the match is forfeited effectively, but I don't think it deals with the rights of players to walk off.
Mm-hmm. No, apparently it doesn't. I'll just move on to a few of the questions, trying to cover them as quick as possible. So Bilal Mirza asked, what responsibility should be put to official supporter club or to official clubs, I guess, to officials or clubs to educate, engage, and support clubs or governing body to prevent all types of victimization and racism?
So we run a program called with the FSA, the Football Supporters Association, called Fans for Diversity, which is helping fans absolutely, support their club, appreciate their club a little bit more. The LGBTQ community have basically formed out of there as well. So they form fan bases out of there as well, community bases, because we have to realise that stadiums are particularly a difficult place for people of colour, for people who are part of the LGBTQ community. And with that, you know, our Fans for Diversity program, which, you know, brings them closer to their football club so that they can support their football club without fear. You know, and I'm not saying that fear alleviates straight away, but definitely it gives them to know that other people are part of that program and actually they look like them and stuff like that is absolutely tremendous for me. So we've had a lot of success over the Fans for Diversity program, and it's something that we're very proud of in terms of, you know, the elimination of the alienation of fans, in terms of, you know, being able to support your own club freely without fear.
Thank you. We're going to jump back into a topic that we covered to answer Andreas de Silas, who asked, from a legal perspective, in a case where an athlete storms out during the match, so what we mentioned, for example, about Mario Balotelli, can we say that this athlete breach his contract by denying to compete? Very specific question, I think, to lawyers. Any thoughts there?
Good luck with that answer.
Elaine, good luck.
I was going to say, in any other employment scenario, if you are being subjected to racial abuse, you're fully within your rights to down tools and walk out. It's a breach of contract in itself. And, you know, and it has an effect on your well-being, your mental health, and could be in danger. I mean, this is, you know, if it was in any other field, we wouldn't be able to. So, you know, could he technically be in breach? Possibly, but he's also suffered a breach by being subjected to a racist attack. So I think that, you know, if he takes reasonable, proportionate action to protect himself in that situation, I think he'd have a very good defence. Put it that way.
Thank you.
Actually, I think Elaine's right. You could almost ask this question, flip it on its head and say, could the player sue the league or the club for not adequately protecting him in his workplace?
I think that would be a very interesting conversation.
That would be an interesting case. Yeah.
I'm looking forward to one of these cases to appear. I'll move on to Martin Frail, who is asking, do the panel have a view on whether incidents of sectarianism are increasing in football alongside an increase in racism? From a Scottish perspective, sectarianism remains a prominent issue. Anyone with some data around this potentially?
I think what I should have said from the outset, from Kick It Out's perspective, we don't work in the Scottish League, the Irish leagues. We're funded to work in English football. We do get a mass amount of reports to say that we have to deal with the issues that are faced around sectarianism, and we've recently been in contact with James McLean because of that as well. But absolutely, it's not our area of work because it's not a funded area of work, so we don't collate or hold any kind of stats around that. And it'd be interesting to know that if all the bodies that do work in this space, whether they do collect that data, because again, it's something that should be shared a lot wider.
Mm-hmm. It'd be actually interesting to stay on that point, to stay with you, Troy, because obviously you manage a lot of reports, and I guess that maybe potentially some international reports as well, even if this is not what you cover, and you have 2 reports officer to cover all this work. Yeah. That doesn't seem much, I suspect, to cover so much work. How do you manage?
Well, to be honest with you, you know, our workforce is 16, 17 strong all week. When you consider that we cover the professional game, the non-league game, the grassroots game, we work within clubs, we provide education, we work with fans. I worry for our 2 reporting officers because of the level of reports they have to deal with, the detail in the reports. And then the kind of, when I mentioned the middle person situation, we get criticised quite a lot for being the middle person and not the people that actually can hand out the kind of sanctions that people want. So they are inundated, and I believe then when football does return somewhere along the line, I mean, we haven't even touched on social media, but they'll be inundated again. It should be an absolute workforce that works on that. When I say workforce, I'm talking anything from 5 upwards. But we have 2 dedicated officers that pull the kind of stats together that come with our middle of the season and end of season figures. But I think someone said it earlier, might have been Craig or Piara, that said actually it's only a minute snapshot of everything that goes on. around. And I think if we did have more officers, we would be able to dedicate certain people to go and find the information that actually is out there, or to work on particular topics that bring more detail up to us. Yes, it would mean a rise in our stats, but I don't have a problem with that at all.
Right. I'll just move on to another question from Josh Charalambou. Should we make it mandatory to have BAME ex-participants as independent members for disciplinary proceedings involving alleged racism? Who would like to take this one on?
If you can take that, Connie.
Yeah, I'll take that. I think panels are obviously stronger, and we've used this word a lot, diversity. When I started on the anti-discrimination panels, my initial experiences weren't great in terms of the representation on the panels. And that's both from an ethnic minority standpoint, but also from professional standpoint. You didn't have much input from those who had actually been in the game, or those with perhaps Equality Act expertise to deal with discrimination. Now it's much better. There is regular training. You have specialist members who are part of those panels. You cannot actually act or join those panels without conducting training. And so I think in answer to the question whether it should be mandatory, potentially, I would prefer that the FA and the sports governing bodies dealing with cases of discrimination nature should ensure that the panels are diverse, because you get much better decisions, which I think the person asking the question has appreciated.
Mm-hmm.
I just add to that, Laura, that going back to a point which Elaine raised really early in all of this about the effect of having a more diverse group of participants helping this fight generally, and picking up on what Ife's just said, that should result in my opinion, the sorts of added training and diversity amongst the panel at large, from which individual panelists are then picked to determine FA cases. If the implication of Josh's question, hi Josh, is that you should specifically make sure you have a BAME ex-participant, ex-footballer or participant in the game on a particular panel because there is an allegation of racism, then I've got a strong answer to that, which is no, because what you will do is you will engender a feeling in people who've contested their cases that, to use the vernacular, they were bound to decide that way, or they were bound to decide this. You are implying necessarily that had that panel involved 3 people who are not of BAME origin, that somehow they would have been less capable of coming to a well-reasoned, proper decision based upon the evidence. That's a really dangerous route, in my opinion, to go down to. It will lead to the polarization and therefore complete lack of trust in the process. So the general pool needs to have all of this diversification, but you shouldn't then be picking people out. I see his name, Marvin Robinson. I agree, for what it's worth. He is an excellent panelist. So that's not a comment against anybody who's on the panel, but you've got to be careful about having a positive approach to the picking of a panel in that way. I don't think we should go that far.
I think you've got to balance that up though, Craig, by, the amount of panels that I've had to during my years sit on in terms of, taking a player into a hearing, and the demographics of the people that I'm looking at that are making judgment on decisions that, without calling it for what it is, that they have no appreciation of. I think there has to be a balance, because again, players of certain ethnicities for far too long have felt that the balance has always been weighed the other way, and they haven't received a fair hearing, and they don't feel that the system appreciates what they've gone through. I'm not quite sure what the balance is, but I just wanted to give an alternative whilst I fully appreciate what you're saying.
So far as the impact is concerned, I wouldn't disagree with you. And it goes back to Piara's point that at the international level, they get to give victim impact statements, so to speak. But I think it's saying something if people are going to start saying anyone other than a BAME person would not be able to come to fair judgment, which is the implication of that approach.
Yeah.
But I think, though, it is actually, to take your point directly, I think the experience that Troy is talking about, the experience that we have, particularly across Europe, where these issues are not debated in the same way, I think the process is not fair unless you have some sort of expertise in terms of the issues that are being discussed. Because it might be that an all-white panel, to put it crudely, doesn't comprehend acts of discrimination, racism, sexism, whatever. And I think there's some kind of, but in the past, we've come across some interesting debates with UEFA where, a Swiss judge cannot comprehend sectarianism in Scotland. It's just
yeah, I agree on the training point. They should be trained. I adopt everything Elaine and Ify have said in that regard.
I find that very interesting because on other panels, specifically around sexism, this is also a question that comes back a lot. Should women be on, involved in discussions around their own rights? And so I find that's an interesting conversation that I think we can continue maybe offline or somewhere online on social media. It seems to be the place where these conversations are being very well discussed. But I think we just need to wrap up the panel because we're coming to the time. But I just want to finish by going around and just asking you guys for one action or one thing that you'd like to see as an improvement. So we talked about, for example, better sharing of data, better gathering of data. But if you had one wish, what would it be? And I'll start with you, Craig, maybe.
I would like the governing bodies, domestic and international, to employ some kind of communication spokesperson or give that role to somebody who's already there to ensure that when these cases and the like are all debated in the press, there is a spokesperson from the organisation explaining those decisions in a way which maybe they're not obvious to understand purely on their writing. We see that in the justice system in the UK. There's judicial spokespeople and the like now. I think that communication could stop the polarisation of the topic, which would in the long term help.
Thank you very much. Ify, any thoughts?
We haven't touched on social media due to time, but I think I would like to see, and I'm not sure if this is already in place, but if there is some sort of memorandum of understanding between the tech companies and law enforcement to address the abuse that's directed at players online. Mm-hmm. Because of course the players, the fans aren't under the jurisdiction of the Football Association. And so they can at will abuse players online with little repercussion except for law enforcement. But often we don't see anything being done. So that's probably one change that I would like to see, if not in place already.
I absolutely am passionate about this topic as well, and the responsibility of those tech companies and those social media platforms who are dealing with a lot of content, and yet the comments that they deal with, they don't necessarily have any repercussions, whether newspaper would be in a lot of troubles if some of the comments were made on their own platform. So I find that a very interesting topic, and maybe we can have another conversation, Sean, about this.
Yeah, there's a discussion between sort of, are they publishers or are they platforms? I know that's another hot topic in
on that point, Ofcom are now going to be regulating online in the UK at least anyway, so that's going to start changing, no doubt. But one of the reasons that I asked Troy to be on the panel, funny enough, was for this reason on social media, with the lack of, bearing in mind the networks. I think it is an important one to just raise, maybe get everyone's wider view on that. I know we're going to overrun slightly, so apologies to everyone, but I do think it's such an important issue that, given that the social networks profiteer off football, off sport across the board, and it would seem, and again I don't know for certain, but it seemed algorithmically, or at least in code, you'll be able to deal and catch, they can stop other sensitive data. What is everyone's view though on that, in terms of why aren't they stopping it? What could they do? Should the FAs, should the leagues be more stronger, let's say, with the network to say, hey, if you're going to be using our content for commercial gains, you need to make sure none of that is associated. I remember years ago, Marks and Spencer's did a thing with, I think it was Marks and John Lewis, with Facebook, ensuring all their content was only placed in certain places for us because of association with brands.
After speaking to you, Sean, the other day, and I said to you about how football has no influence in this space, the great president of the United States tweeted literally our morning that, and his tweet says, at Twitter is now interfering in the 2020 presidential election. Now, for me, that shows, and listen, I've never endorsed anything that the President of the United States has said. Can I just throw that out there straight away? But also it shows that the social media companies have so much power, so much influence. When we're talking about discrimination, to mute words, to not allow words to be typed if they really wanted to. I understand that they also block certain words during our own, the campaign for Prime Minister. Certain words could not be put out there because it would have influenced the people that were voting. But yet in football, or when it comes to football players, it's a freedom of speech platform. And that can only be highlighted with what happened to Ian Wright lately. And Ian Wright is only the tip of a number of stories like that, where he was not only racially abused, he was threatened. Someone even said that they'd walk up to him and spit covert in his face. Now, when you think of that, and when you think of the poor lady who worked at Victoria Station, who died because someone did exactly that same thing, that is a threat. That is a massive threat. And it's something that writers had to deal with. But yet it's not uncommon for our black players and our players of different ethnicity that apply their trade in the English divisions. The amount of times players have just DM'd me and said, look, I've got this today. Look, I've got that today.
Sorry to push you. I can, because I know you, so it's all right.
Sorry, yeah.
But in terms of best practice, then in that regards, what would you like to see done, building on Laura's excellent question? Just to another panelist get a chance.
Listen, we've sat around the table with Twitter, and we've sat around the table with Facebook, and I've walked away actually thinking they're not going to do absolutely nothing at all. So that point where they need to talk to football's bodies to come to an agreement of what they can do and what they can't do. For me, this is the new form of racism or discrimination, and that is going to exist for a very long time while fans are not being allowed in a stadium. So some kind of some kind of recognition from the platforms that they need to do better, and then that they'll be working with football to actually try and eliminate it from their platforms, and that will go much further than football anyway.
You wonder, and I may be wrong for Elaine, sorry for this, but I think it's such an important issue that no one's really talking about. It drives me nuts. Is that if you can make put agreements in place, so if you're broadcasting a certain match, for example, you can restrict how people view. You can put terms in, right, and it's a contract. If you're going to give people the opportunity to broadcast, right, could they not start to enforce, given the value of them, could they not start to enforce certain codes of conduct against the people, like the platforms who are using their content, essentially? So could we come up with, and I'm saying this putting out there, could we come up with a code of guidelines in which people will agree to adhere to, right, if they're going to be allowing fans to participate in conversation? I'm not sure if you've seen it, Elaine, in your previous or other lines of work.
Well, I mean, it's something that they can do. They had all recent, not that long ago, there was the whole furor about the privacy issues. You just need to put it as part of your terms and conditions. It's not that difficult. And I think Les Ferdinand recently said, in relation to the Ian Wright situation, that social media was able to block and deal with the COVID conspiracy comments quite readily. But with these comments, it's just a freedom of speech issue. That's not acceptable. I think there needs to be greater joined up approach in terms of the stakeholders coming together as a coalition to put some real pressure on social media to take some concerted actions. They can make it part of the terms and conditions when you sign up to these platforms, but they will not tolerate certain forms of language. Simple as, just stop it. It'll be blocked, it'll be muted, and it won't be allowed.
Great. Okay, we should work on that. We're doing loads of other projects, so we should work on doing something on that, like on an open source project. I'm quite serious. Sorry.
I think on this issue, actually, I mean, it's quite interesting because we are working right now with FIFPro on a global project to demonstrate the sort of abuse that the players get, male and female. And we're involved in a project with Google right now. And Google are lovely, very touchy-feely, very concerned about social change. But I think one of the big issues we have here is that, firstly, the thing that these platforms fear is greater regulation, going back to my theme of the day. So much so that they've recruited the former, Deputy Prime Minister of the UK. Facebook have recruited him in order to lead on their public affairs, right? That's how serious they take it. And then secondly, we know that unless we have an approach at a state level, unless we have all of the states, so the European Union are doing quite a lot on this now, coming together and demanding greater regulation, a shift from, you know, a fundamental free speech approach to one which respects people's rights, other rights, we're not going to see that change. And that's why I personally think the EU really is the way forward. I think even the British state on its own probably is not going to make as many gains.
So it needs to be state actors. That's going to be a nightmare. We can't deal with that with most things. In a sense, that's the problem. Laura, did you want to have something to...
I'm just going to come back to Craig, actually, the point that you written, just in case some people haven't seen it, which is an interesting point, if you want to elaborate on this.
Yeah, I think I just threw it into the chat there on the side as well, which people may not realize. I know Troy and probably Piara do. If you commit an offence which violates the FA's, the English FA's discrimination rules, E32, but you only commit it via, in writing only, and via a public broadcast network or social media, the mandatory minimum sanction which applies in the case of an oral offence, which is 6 matches suspension for the first offence and 7 for the second, but with an entry point, I think, of 11, if you can correct me if I'm wrong on that, they do not apply. So I presume that rule is a relic of when social media was relatively new, didn't necessarily have a huge output, and was justified because presumably somebody, I don't agree with this, but somebody somewhere thought if you say something in writing only and not face-to-face, it's less invasive and might be less damaging to that person. So, but now, arguably, whilst I still think something said face-to-face could be much more damaging to the victim, although not necessarily so, you've got players with millions of followers who tweet things, and it doesn't have to be a player, could be anybody else, and it's permanent. It gets screenshotted and it's there for good. So I have never understood the justification for the FA not applying. It's not to say a panel such as IFES might not give such a sanction, but not to apply the mandatory minimum in those cases is quite astonishing. And it rests behind, actually, if he mentioned the Mendy case. Mendy was the victim, of course, of a comment made by Bernardo Silva. That was part of the reason why, because that comment was made through Twitter, the sanction came down to, I think it was 1 match, although there's unique mitigation there. But that rule is astonishing to me. It needs to be changed now. It needs to be changed tomorrow, basically.
It's very interesting, and I think obviously there's a lot of work to be done to improve and to progress on this topic. I find it very interesting the points that you all raised about stakeholder engagements and potentially putting pressure on these companies that, let's not forget, have more power than most of our countries in terms of reach, in terms of communication, in terms of influence, and yet we want our sometimes broken institutions to deal with them and put pressure on them. So I find that very interesting and a wonderful challenge. And I hope there's going to be a panel discussions on this and some more research done. Is there any other actions that anyone wants to raise and something that they would like to see happen in the coming months or years?
I'm just conscious, did we answer Martin's question? Martin feels about 6 years.
Yes.
No? The one
mine would be the one about the data sharing. For me, that could spark so many different things if we all had a collective understanding of various aspects of reporting, various aspects of what's going on with the mandatory code, and it's just good practice, isn't it, to share the data that you have so that we can come out with different solutions. But football doesn't really do that.
And I will be cliche, but what gets measured gets done. So that's obviously a really good point to start. Elaine, would you like to add something?
Following on from Troy, and I said it before, I think the other part of it is to extend the mandatory code to the Premier League, because I think that sends a very powerful message. If you actually are encouraging diversity in appointments at the highest level, then you're much more likely to get trickle-down effect, which is very powerful. So.
Wonderful. And for our international listeners, have a look at the mandatory code if you're not familiar with it, and see if you can implement even better where you're from. Piara, did you have maybe a point to?
Well, I think actually for your international listeners, I think we'd want to see more of these sort of debates taking place in different territories. You know, I think the fact that we're really getting to grips with some pretty detailed stuff, the nitty-gritty of how regulation needs to address these sorts of issues is a positive, and we don't really see that in many other countries. You might sometimes see that at UEFA, FIFA level, internationally, but you wouldn't have this conversation in Spain or even somewhere like Germany, you know, and it's needed. People need to really come to terms with it, the issues that we're talking about, and begin to plan the way forward. Otherwise, regulation internationally is such a huge mixed bag that it's almost, it veers between laughable and tragic, I think.
Interesting. Well, I think that's it for the panel. Sean, I'll hand it over to you if you want to conclude, perhaps.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I think it's an excellent panel, brilliantly. I told you were fabulous at the beginning, and you were fabulous moderators. So thank you for getting through all the questions and doing a great job. Thank you to all the panelists. It's as you've articulated, a very broad area, a very difficult, a very challenging area, dealing with multiple stakeholders. The one thing that I talk about a lot, and I know I've talked to you all privately about this, I think we shared a similar view. My big fear, LawInSport's big fear, is a lack of diversity of thought that then leads to pooling of all the other different metrics as well. So, you know, we've got some imbalances to correct, but, you know, if this is something you're interested in, if you're interested in diversity, inclusion, equality, you know, we put on these conferences, and this is the right panel to say it. We spend every year, and Piara, we talked about this last year, Troy, we talked about, you know, before of our conferences, trying to make them as diverse as possible. And let's be clear, in my opinion, the access levels are just not there. The exception doesn't prove the norm, and unfortunately you can find pockets of people, but there seems to be a lot of tick boxing going on, or about a genuine desire to really change. Like Troy, I put in the chat that we were talking with Elaine 2014 when we did that podcast about the board scheme. Right?
We spoke about that last night, Elaine.
Yeah, so you know, I think there's loads of action points we can probably take from this. Thanks to Laura as well for focusing the discussion on that. I think we'll follow that up. We're looking to set up a working group, quite seriously, I'm not joking, on this issue more broadly across sport. Work with some fantastic people on our editorial board in the States who helped write, Jeremy Drew, who helped write the Rooney Rule. If you're interested, drop me a line, let us know, and we'll loop up, because I think there's a lot of work to be done here, so we can create some guidelines then. But thank you all so much. As I said, I say it on every panel, we don't take any editorial content on LawInSport at all. We don't, we take no sponsors, no one pays to speak, we don't pay anyone to speak. Everyone on here is super busy. They're giving up their time for free to coordinate this, all the prep calls, do everything. I'd just like to give a virtual round of applause and thank you all for your excellent contributions. Really appreciate it. And I hope you have a great evening and a great day wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.